Perfect. Yes, thank you again, Kristina. That was amazing. So moving on to our panel session. So the structure that we'll follow is that we'll go through all three of the talks we have today, and then we'll follow that up with questions. So I will be keeping an eye on both chats. So if you have any questions, please just write them in, and I will ask them at the end. So welcome to our panel, AI and Junior Lived Experience. We've got three talkers for you today, three speakers even. So our first speaker will be Rys Farthing from Reset Technology, who will be talking about out of the coal mines and into data mines, surveillance, surveillance capitalism and children. The next talk will be Joseph Savirimuthu from the University of Liverpool, talking about AI in the classroom. We don't get no education. And our third speaker will be Mina Vasalou from UCL, who will be talking about adaptive Navigo reflections in the classroom. So Rys, if you kick us off, go ahead.
Brilliant, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Some thumbs up, good, all right. Well, as was mentioned, my name is Rys and I'm from Reset Australia. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about young people today. I've got 10 to 15 minutes, I was told, but what I'd rather do is talk a little bit quicker and leave a bit more time, so maybe 10 minutes and leave a bit more time for discussions at the end. Is that okay? Brilliant, all right, and please do drop some questions in the chat if you've got them as we go. If I manage to see them, I can pick them up and see if I can talk to them as well. If I can handle that amount of multitasking, I can give it a whirl. So can I start by saying thank you to Kristina for that wonderful introduction. It was a really, troubling but important story to hear. And also a really nice contrast, because I think I've got a slightly different take on how technology and indentured servitude could work that comes in from a different angle. And I think what I'm going to try and talk about is a little bit about how the digital world has sort of unconsensually co-opted young people's lives, whether that's their day-to-day lived experience, from their education to their leisure time. Anything that they do is a sort of fuel for the commercial machine, and a bit about what we can do about it and what can be done. So I just want to start, if I can, by saying I am so not the only person talking about this, and I'd like to recognise the real thinkers in this space. If you are keen, I recommend having a look at some of the works of Donald Holloway at Edith Cowan or Deborah Lupton at UNSW. But I will parrot some of their thinking and then add to it a bit about what we're doing if we can. So I'm going to start by painting a scene about children and their relationship to commercial enterprise or to sort of work, if you will. And I want to acknowledge that how we think about children and work or labour, which now we sort of see it as a violation of their rights, is a very new way of thinking about children and their relationship to the economy. If you'll forgive, a sort of 30-second, very Eurocentric potted history, but across Europe and across the US, right through until sort of the mid-1850s, child labour really just was a norm. So in pre-industrial societies, children toiled on farms or occasionally as apprentices. And when the Industrial Revolution hit, at least for working class children, they really followed their parents into the factories and down the coal mines. And these practices were sort of perfectly normalised. And they were sort of so normalised that when families hit on hard times and found themselves in poor houses or these workhouses, it was actually sort of standard expectation that children in poor houses would work too. Trading children's time for other people's profit was just considered an absolute norm. And it took a long time for these norms to change. I think in the UK, it was the Factory Acts, which was a series of around 14 laws in total that started in the early 1800s that really started to reflect, I think, a sort of growing ill-ease with children's economic exploitation. And one by one, these Factory Acts really started to rein it in and pull children out of the workforce. So, for example, in 1819, the first Factory Act, limited children to working a mere 12 hours a day. I mean, that was a progressive law at the time, sort of saying children can only work 12 hours a day. And in 1831, this was reduced again, at least in cotton mills, to 8 hours for 9 to 11-year-olds. And the under 8s were carved out of the cotton mills completely. So you can see, like, progressively this sort of started to change from a pretty dire, what we would now recognize as a dire situation. But it's worth noting that this change wasn't fast, nor has it by any means been universal. So 70 years after the first Factory Act in the US, the sort of 1900 census records that 1 in 6 children in the US were still employed in full-time occupations. And in low-income countries today, child labour still persists. So in 2017, around half of all children in Mali, Chad and Guinea-Bissau were recorded as working. And this, I think, potted history was not to sort of, outline that, gosh, we've done great things, we're in a great situation now. But I think it's just to highlight that there really has been a global trend towards the reduction of child labour, even if this ambition has not been perfectly achieved yet. There's a sort of global consensus, a near global consensus now, that children shouldn't labour. Indeed, Goal 8.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals aims to end child labour in all its forms by 2025, which is only 4 years off. So we really better get moving on that if we're serious about it. So all of this is to say that it's now this sort of widely accepted norm that in any modern economic system, you don't expect children to contribute in the same way as adults. And where they do, where children have to contribute as if they were adults, it's a violation of children's rights. But up against this global consensus, we've seen the rise of surveillance capitalism, which has really worryingly, I think, repositioned children and young people as data labourers. And what do I mean by this? Well, if you go back to the work of Shoshana Zuboff, as a lot of people do, she argues that we've entered a new economic age, the age of surveillance capitalism. And in this kind of new economic model, every single citizen, be they adult or child, is a potential target for and producer of data. Every action of our day-to-day lives is surveilled, leaving behind a rich, what she calls a data exhaust, that's harvested and mined without meaningful consent. So this data and all of the insights that's derived from it is treated as if it is proprietary, as if it's sort of owned by the data harvesters and the miners that collect it, and somehow unrelated to the people who produce it and the lives they lead. So while this data exhaust might not seem like a kind of big deal, I sort of sit here and I'm like, oh, it's just my data, whatever, have it, it's precisely this personal data that's allowed these tech companies, including Uber and Lyft, to become some of the largest and most profitable companies the world has ever seen. And it's not by accident that people refer to personal data as the new oil. And it's our behavioural surplus, as Shoshana puts it, that fuels this economic model. And this business model includes children and their behavioural surplus. So this is the new time for profit nexus. And we see this because we know that at the moment, the estimate is that by the time a child turns 13, so you've got to think at 13, no one is claiming that anyone under 13 could possibly ever consent to this. By the time a child turns 13, advertisers already hold an estimated 72 million data points about them. And so once again, in this new economic system, we're seeing children being treated as if they were adults, without any consent, without any say in it, and without any means of escaping it. But just as the Factory Acts reflected advocacy, a lot of hard work from a lot of advocates, and a sort of growing social unease with, children working in cotton mills, we're starting to see new laws and regulations that are being passed to rein in these practices. The UK, where I'm currently sitting at the moment, has really led the way with the passage of the Age Appropriate Design Code. And this code regulates, the use of children's data, and insists that children's data can only be used in ways that are consistent with their best interests, which is a human rights principle. So it says that you can only use kids' data, you can only use it if it's in their best interests, and you especially can't use it in ways that could harm them. And so this means that businesses that now collect and use children's data need to actively think about children's welfare and wellbeing in their business practices. In short, they need to prioritise children's best interests over their own commercial interests. And while in the UK, this law's only been in force for about a month now, it came into force in September, we started to see it protect children from the kind of unfettered business model of surveillance capitalism a little bit. Children have started to be carved out of data collection and data targeting practices. So, small things like Google have announced that they'll no longer allow micro-targeting to under 18s. Facebook have unveiled a sort of curtailed micro-targeting practice as well. TikTok and YouTube have announced that they've made children's profiles private by default, which limits the amount of data collected and broadcast in the first place. And so again, change may be long and slow, but there's hope, there's the signs that we're carving children out of this business model progressively and also globally. So after the UK passed their age-appropriate design code, France, Sweden and the Netherlands have all produced similar guidance regulating the use and collection of children's data to ways that's in their best interests. And Ireland has published and is consulting on draft guidance. Very excitingly, Australia announced a very similar code and put forward a draft bill on Monday that we've been doing a lot of work around at Reset. And the US too has legislation in front of the House and also the Senate. It's got two pieces of legislation in front of Congress at the moment that would both amend their child online privacy laws in a similar fashion to kind of implement that best interest principle. So there's some really, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I basically think there's some early positive signs that this is a global trend towards regulating, towards passing new versions of these factory acts to remove children from this new business model. Now, I just want to be perfectly clear as I paint that historical situation and that modern situation, that I'm not in any way suggesting that the experiences of growing up as a child in a Victorian cotton mill or as a farmhand in contemporary sub-Saharan Africa are the same thing as growing up in a surveillance economy. But what I am suggesting is that we need to affirm or to reaffirm our global belief that children should not be treated as if they were adults in any economic system. And just as it may be shocking to think about now when I say it, that the Factory Act had to protect children from industrial capitalists by limiting children to working only 12 hours a day or carving out only those under 9 years old from the workforce, I'm hoping that it's equally shocking to think about the fact that democracies around the world today, right now, are currently passing laws to tell surveillance capitalists that they cannot use children's data in ways that's actively known to harm them in the pursuit of profits. Simply put, we need to ensure that all economic systems, from surveillance capitalism to post-industrial economies, have adequate carve-out for kids. And I think that this sort of regulation is a really great place to start. So I'll leave it there and hand back over to the panel.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rys. So